Okay, ladies and gentlemen, if you're ready, I think we'll make a start on this. As befits a conference in rural development and innovation, we are going to try and short time and actually make the lunch 12:30. So, with your permission, I'll start now. Just a very quick introduction. My name is Ian Ryder. I'm the head of regional development for the Western Development Commission. I'd just like to say, first of all, thank you to everyone from the first session for a most invigorating discussion. And also, on behalf of the WDC, I think thank you very much for Minister Hogan and Minister Coveney for the foresight to have such a programme for rural development that really impacts the people that we represent within our region. Also the departments, and of course Chagas, who, as Pat has already said, have done an amazing team. I won't name individuals, they know who they are, and they've been a pleasure to work with. But also Pat himself for his energy and commitment. I think you've seen some of it today, and hopefully as we go through today's session we will focus on opportunities and real things to do so that we can get this shown to you. It would be amiss if I didn't say something about the WDC in the context of what we're discussing, and I'll keep it very short. I think we have been working in this area for a while. We do work in the areas of finance, foundations and frameworks for rural development, and by that I mean we do try and provide solutions for access to finance, as we mentioned by some people today. And I noted in the previous section, one of the speakers talked about diversification in the true sense into creative industries and renewable energy, all of which I'm delighted to say we present some sort of support mechanisms for. I think it is important also to say that the foundations for all of this is based on really good research and policy work as befits such a conference. And as you'll hear later on today from my colleague Cedra, you'll get a sample of some of the work that's going on there. The reason I feel I can say this is we are the most rural of regions, not only in Ireland but in Europe. We are on the periphery as well as on the edge. We like to think that that gives us strength and opportunities and not just marginalisation. The last thing I'd like to say before presenting or overviewing our two speakers today and then moving on is just, I think Pat said something about a job strategy for rural Ireland, and that's what we need to focus on as we go through today, I think, because it is those recommendations that is the precursor to change, and I think that's what we all really aspire to in the group that I've seen formed over the last 9 months or so. I think it's not a question of balanced growth, rather a question of common sense optimal growth for Ireland. And I use that word again, Ireland. That's what we must focus on today, because this is too big a problem for us all to be pulling in different directions. And I think I've seen great signs this morning of us moving towards a common concerted push for true development, not for ourselves but for our children. And I think that's something to be aspired to. Okay, that's enough about that. What I'd like to say very quickly is I'd like to welcome Professor Sally Shortall from Queen's University, who will be speaking here today in response. Sally is a professor of sociology and brings a wealth of experience, as you can see in her biography, from areas internationally and nationally around rural development. And waiting at the podium is Kevin Hinu, who is economist with Chagas. And what we're going to do is we're going to keep it very short today for both of our panel up here. We'll probably have around 15 minutes, because what we want to do is leave as much time as Pat has said for a consultation discussion with you before we get you out to lunch. So thank you for your attention, and I'll leave you.
Thanks very much, Ian. Good morning, everyone. Thanks, Melina, for the invitation to come here and present today on this theme of supporting enterprise in rural areas. With my new time constraint, I'm just going to delve right into it. Okay, I'll just talk a little bit about where I see this presentation fitting in today and how I approach it. Okay? It's essentially based on the material that has been derived from a review of literature and evidence around supporting enterprise in rural areas as part of the background Cedra activities, and also feedback from the public consultations and the stakeholder meetings that Cedra has held in the first 6 months of this year. So it's a feedback on those, but I think it's also, and I'd like to make this quite clear, I think it ties in with some of the comments in the morning session. I'd like to have this as a call as well for evidence around best practice on supporting enterprise in rural areas, on interesting case studies on supporting enterprise, on local programs that are particularly supported enterprise in the local areas. I think we need that type of case study type evidence to support the more general feedback that we've got so far to date and the review of the research that I'm going to present here as well today. So just take that as an open call. I think I'd like some feedback on this after this conference to the appropriate Cedra websites, whatever. So what were we looking at here? We were looking specifically and talking specifically and thinking around the publicly funded support infrastructure. What are we talking about when we talk about support? We just talk about external resources that enterprises use from time to time. Essentially what we're talking about. Okay, so it's the wide variety of resources. There's four main sections in this presentation. What do we know about enterprise in rural areas? What kind of challenges do enterprise in rural areas face? The support infrastructure, the support landscape there at the moment, and kind of issues that are arising for clarification or emerging questions that are coming out of the work so far. I think echoing maybe one of the comments in the morning session as well, any of us who are working on the ground in this type of area, we instinctively know a lot of this stuff and we see it. That's not to say that we shouldn't tease it out of it and reshape it and insert it into the Cedra research report and the strategy document. What do we know about enterprise in rural areas? The first point there seems a little bit silly, but it's just a point of information really. In looking at enterprise and the support for enterprises, we're looking at all enterprises. There's essentially no limits. Sometimes these discussions are around particular types of rural enterprises per se that you want to get in rural areas. But this is quite open. So it was a broad brush-to-stroke approach to see what kind of enterprise and supports them were important. But we have general agreement, I think, about the broad context and issues that are framing enterprise and when we think about enterprise in rural areas and supports to them. One of them is, I think, there's agreement around we need to follow a high road strategy. In other words, we're never going to be competing again, if you like, on price competition, on low cost competition. And in that context, innovation is critical, innovation is central, and raising debt to the LEADER program, for instance. We know, and it's a fact of economic life, that economic development is lumpy or uneven. We know that there are barometer forces that are inclined to pull some types of enterprises into particular locations. That changes over time. It's not fixed. If you look at the history of agglomeration, it's not fixed into the future. But it is a fact of life. It's one of those macro factors we have to be conscious of. Reflecting that, I think the industrial landscape and the enterprise landscape is very dynamic and changing. And in the context of that, it's quite difficult, I suppose, to formulate policy and policy recommendations and policy responses. And I think that dynamism is changing and it's increasing all the time. So that is a challenge, I think, when we consider what recommendations we can put in the final strategy. It's quite clear that there are a mix of different types of industries, a mix of different types of ownerships, foreign and indigenous, and a mix of different types of sectors required to underpin a vibrant and dynamic industrial base or enterprise base in rural areas into the future. And support infrastructure is going to be messy, it's going to be complex, because we cannot talk about these enterprises, I think, in their entirety. Although there might be general principles, one policy, I don't think fits all in our case. So, just thinking a little bit, and this is maybe digging down a little bit into the issues around enterprise and entrepreneurship. What are we talking about really? We're talking about supporting starting up or startups of new businesses, but also supporting in some way existing businesses or SMEs that are expanding or developing. If you look at startups in particular, there is this notion of breaking down entrepreneurship into two categories. Opportunistic or opportunity entrepreneurs and necessity entrepreneurs. And they're different. An opportunistic entrepreneur is someone, if you like, who is used to risk taking, who maybe could be a serial entrepreneur, who has, more importantly, the skills and capabilities to develop a business, and is probably in a supportive environment in order to do so. A necessity entrepreneur is someone who is coming to self-employment or startup driven by necessity. The alternatives, the options for employment are not necessarily there. And if we look at Ireland's position around these two types of entrepreneurs, we have more necessity entrepreneurs than comparable countries, than the EU 27, the EU 15, the US, the UK. And that has been growing over the last decade. It's virtually doubled the number of necessity entrepreneurs. The idea in terms of considering this in terms of enterprise supports is that these people may need different supports. Why? Because they most likely need stronger intangible supports. They need stronger supports on that type of level as opposed to technical supports. And this is a segment of entrepreneurs that have been growing over the last decade. Okay, what generally do we know about enterprises in rural areas? Generally, we probably all know this, but I think it's quite useful to be confronted with as well. And if you look at the pie chart on the left, micro-enterprises. So enterprises, this is in the economy in general, by the way, not just rural areas. But I think the picture is going to be reflecting rural areas. Micro-enterprises make up 90% of all our enterprises. They have a huge contribution to employment in the enterprise sector. And if we include small enterprises with that, so up to 50 employees, they include the majority. We're talking about 98% or so. So contrary sometimes to conventional wisdom, in terms of the number of enterprises, our enterprise landscape is dominated by very, very small businesses. Very, very small businesses. And I think that has implications for not only the nature of supports, but also the delivery of supports as well. If we just look to the right-hand side, it's just pulling this idea apart a little bit. If we look at SMEs, as I said, they account for 99% of all active enterprises. Their contribution to employment is less. They contribute about 70% of all employment. So that is still a significant contribution, and still roughly around 50% of all turnover of enterprises in the economy, and 50% of all gross value added. So, these are extremely important contributors to economic activity. If we just look at the pie chart on the left in terms of employment contribution, the number of persons engaged, just look at the micro, the red on the top right, the micro segment. So it's basically saying that all the micro enterprises in the country contribute 27% of all employment. So they're extremely significant. We haven't got definitive data in terms of rural areas, but I think that proportion is higher obviously in rural areas. So where does this all lead us? Just this thinking about the different types of entrepreneurs, the different types of businesses in rural areas. As I said, I think thinking about the different types of entrepreneurs per se in terms of necessity and opportunity entrepreneurs will lead us to think about potentially different supports that are needed. As I've said, contribution of small and medium enterprises, including that vast tranche of micro enterprises, is extremely important to economic activity and employment. I suppose the key for us when we're thinking about these things and reflecting on them and looking for recommendations is there something distinctively different about enterprises in rural areas in some way that they need particular supports? I mean, that's the fundamental issue, I think, that we have to either gather and produce evidence on to turn into recommendations. Because otherwise it's going to be subsumed within the general enterprise policy and the general industrial policy, which just looks at all enterprises in general. So there's something distinctly different about enterprises in rural areas that they need particular supports. And I think there's lots of evidence on this. And all of us in this room probably know this instinctively. In relation to looking at firms per se and enterprise in rural areas, they're smaller. That big tranche of micro enterprises. We know that because they're smaller, they're also constrained in terms of their capabilities and their resources, for their human resources, their financial resources, their capabilities in terms of their technical and marketing capabilities, They're generally less growth intensive, and that has implications at the moment in terms of their eligibility for certain supports that already exist, and they're often considered less innovative. These are general patterns which we don't have a lot of evidence on for rural enterprise in Ireland. So we need to strengthen that particular piece of evidence as well. In terms of the external environment which firms are located within, it's quite clear that firms being located in rural areas, there's generally this problem of what they call institutional thinness. It's difficult to access supports, whether there be financial supports, technical supports, mentoring supports. And that's the reason of geography, street geography. But also in addition to that, there's issues around the small local markets, so therefore there's a challenge to small and even rural businesses to expand out of their local markets more quickly, so they're challenged with a new set of capabilities they need to address new markets, while at the same time being distanced from those markets geographically. So these are the bones of the distinct challenges that rural enterprises have. When you look at this against the various criteria for supporting enterprises at the moment, membership of a particular sector, growth potential, and size. These are three of the key kind of criteria. For instance, Enterprise Ireland funding is specifically targeted towards high growth firms, in general terms. And county enterprise boards and leader companies can't fund or easily fund firms over a certain size. So there's lots of criteria that kind of creep in here that are particularly pertinent in terms of rural SMEs. If we look at kind of the benefits and difficulties generally associated with establishing, if you like, enterprises in rural areas, I mean these, I just pulled this out of a good body economic consultants report on entrepreneurship in Ireland in 2002. And these are just as pertinent today. These general challenges and benefits and difficulties that are faced by rural entrepreneurs. If we turn to looking at the support infrastructure, if you like, or landscape out there for rural enterprises, it's quite complex. This is pulled out of the recent Department of Public Expenditure report, cross-cutting paper on enterprise support. So they looked at these five departments, five key, if you like, enterprise support departments, and the various agencies under those departments who have a remit of some description in terms of enterprise supports. So, it's quite a complex landscape, and it's even more complex if you're a micro enterprise or someone thinking of starting a business in a rural area. Where do you go to for support? What agency can you approach? Is this the best agency to approach? Can they provide you with the actual support selection? It's interesting to look at, just even briefly, the kind of distinctions that are involved and the types of activities that these agencies are involved in. And this is just looking at four of them. If you look specifically at delivering enterprise support, so this is providing finance, providing training, in some cases providing equity. We have about 9 agencies involved. The differences of why they're involved with different types of businesses depends on the scale of the enterprise, whether they're micro, small, large, particular sectors, whether they're likely to grow rapidly in a short period of time, the particular geographical area they may be focused on. Some of these are more regionally focused and nationally focused. And if we look at the activities around industry promotion and marketing, that's sectorally focused. Policy advice, that's again distinguished by its geographic focus. For instance, we have four of us looking at the national picture, Western Development Commission providing policy advice in terms of its region. And looking at attracting foreign direct investment, again, there's distinctions there around the geographic focus or geographic activity of a particular enterprise. You're not expected to look at and read all of this, but this is just trying to actually, again, take it from that same Department of Expenditure Reform paper, looking at just the multiplicity of different agencies and different types of activities that are involved in. And just picking out 3 of them, there's something like 8 different agencies involved in giving financial support according to different criteria to different rural SMEs. There's 4 actually supplying premises, as it's called here. So providing hard infrastructure, 4 agencies to rural SMEs, or to SMEs in general. And then there's 10 agencies providing training, various types of training, to SMEs in general again. So there's this complex web of agencies and criteria and different types of offerings of support. That's the existing system. We're all aware in this room as well of the proposed changes, proposed or ongoing changes to the support system as well. Particularly there is the effort to develop a new small and micro enterprise support structure, the idea of creating a centre of excellence within Enterprise Ireland, the establishment of the local enterprise offices, and through those enterprise offices, developing a one-stop shop in conjunction with the local authorities that would provide a front end, as I understand it, to this morass of an enterprise support infrastructure that we just looked at in the previous slide. Okay, so it'll provide an access point to that. And we're all fairly familiar with that particular ongoing change. Pulling all this together a little bit, you know, what's been coming back in terms of the consultations, in terms of thinking about this, in terms of the questions that have been raised, the outstanding issues that need clarification. It's come back quite clearly there's a low level of awareness by many enterprises of the support available, and that is probably a function of the existing complexity and difficulty about identifying the correct access point if you want support for what you want to do. I think allied to that, this notion that we need to be more proactive in seeking out and encouraging enterprises and entrepreneurs to provide support to, rather than waiting necessarily for them to identify the supports that they need. So a proactive rather than a reactive approach. In terms of the one-stop shop, or the first-stop shop that's going to be developed within the local employment offices, I think we need to think a bit about how the particular needs of rural enterprises, or enterprises in rural areas, can be supported or incorporated into those local enterprise offices. What would it actually look like, given what we here in this room know about the challenges that rural enterprise faces? What would these local enterprise offices need to have to facilitate the types of enterprises you know getting access to the type of support you think they would need? And allied to that, this idea of, well, for supporting enterprises, how local is local? How local does the delivery mechanism or system have to be? And this is kind of linked to this notion, particularly of necessity and opportunity entrepreneurs. The notion behind necessity entrepreneurs is they need more of a supportive and an intangible support structure, probably at a local level. Because they may be coming from localities, communities, where entrepreneurship isn't even valued all that much. So you're talking about a completely different, maybe more long-term set of supports that are needed to encourage the level of entrepreneurship that is needed in these areas. So in this case, it's not necessarily just an issue about physical access to supports or access points to support. It's also about a cultural change and cultural access and changing culture in communities, and that's a different type of animals, to use a better word. How do we close those gaps in the support eligibility criteria? We already know that the enterprise boards and leader companies, for instance, concentrate primarily on smaller companies. Enterprise Ireland concentrates on high growth companies, say companies with companies who are non-traded, if you like, those companies who are focused on domestic economy, who may be employing more than 15 people. Where can they look to for support? It's a particular gap that has arisen. And these are particularly important kind of businesses and enterprises in rural areas. So what kind of support can be targeted at those? And how could that be delivered to the local employment office, the local enterprise offices? And there's some other overarching concerns, of course, that have arisen in terms of infrastructure. These are, if you like, base kind of concerns that need to be addressed anyway, but are outside of the enterprise support framework, if you like. Issues around infrastructure, particularly around broadband and roads, incubation centres space for appropriate space for enterprises. The regulatory burden, I'm sure we've heard about this earlier on this morning actually as well, delivers a disproportionately high cost on small and medium enterprises, and access to finance as well. This is the last one. I just want to, if you like, roll down to the last 2 points of this slide, because I've already mentioned the first 3. What is the role of social enterprise in terms of job creation? And what is the relationship between social enterprise and the support structure for social enterprise and the support structure for enterprise in general? Should social enterprise be included within or under that general enterprise support structure? If so, what types of social enterprise? Because all these are important generators in many cases of employment and activity and provision of services as well. What is the relationship with these and the broader enterprise support system? And I suppose I called here at the very beginning of this for feedback, and would welcome feedback in terms of evidence around particular programs, particular case studies of entrepreneurship that could feed back into Cedra and inform this piece of work as well. Because I think we have an absence of research and evidence around issues around rural enterprises in particular. A lot of what we have is quite dated, because back a decade or more, and as I said in the very beginning, things have changed so dramatically, and things are changing so dramatically that we need an evidence base around this, and probably an ongoing evidence base. Okay, thanks very much.
Well, I'd like to thank Kevin very much for a very interesting overview. We heard about opportunistic necessity, entrepreneurial. Please forgive me being the necessity chairperson there, and we're moving along with you very well. We heard about differentiation of rural enterprises. We heard about one-stop shop. Now I'd like to invite Professor Sally Shorthold perhaps to frame a response to these interesting points.
Thank you very much, and thanks very much for the invitation to be here today. It's a really interesting event, and I'm sorry I can't stay for the whole day, but despite having done research on gender relations and the importance of evidence to inform policy, my 2 boys have maths exams tomorrow, and if I'm not there to cook them a very specific dinner at a very specific time, they'll fail, and that'll be my fault. So I don't mess with superstition in some occasions. I'm a discussant, so I won't speak for more than 5 minutes. My role is simply to kind of make some comments and open up the discussion, although I don't think I really need to do much of that given this morning. Kevin, thanks very much for a really interesting paper. There's a few points. I guess one of the things I'm going to pick up on is this whole idea of the links between urban and rural areas and how we increasingly deal with that messy reality. And Kevin talked about whether we're talking about rural enterprises or enterprises in rural areas. And I thought this was a really interesting question, given David Meredith's graph this morning that showed that some urban people commute to work in rural areas and vice versa. So we're not talking about again, I thought that was interesting in terms of Kevin's comments about access to markets and business expertise, because again, that's going to mean very different types of rural areas in Ireland, because some are more accessible than others. I also think this idea of the necessity versus opportunity entrepreneurs is really interesting. And it'd be interesting to see urban-rural differences for those figures, and also what the differences in success, survival rates might be like. That would be interesting too. But I guess the one thing that strikes me very much is that urban and rural areas don't operate in isolation, and a number of people have raised this this morning. And what happens in rural areas matters from what happens in urban areas, and vice versa. Pat Spillane talked about, needing a one-stop shop and rural being parts of other policies that don't care so much. But that's the reality. And there's also some work on that looks at the EU level, how rural can often leave a residual in other policies that have another focus. But in a sense, we should expect that. Business, entrepreneurship, enterprise are going to be policies that affect both rural and urban areas in any nation state. It says in my blurb I've been involved in some recent work with the OECD, which looks at relationships between rural and urban areas, and I think they're about to invent a new word called urban. All I can do is I have no clarity on that. But it does look at the interlinkages between urban and rural areas, and this idea that synergy is positive for both. And this is something that from the case studies we carried out, it seems that where you have a strong local government structure which allows for innovation and that has strong vertical links with the national government that's providing institutional support, enterprise and development generally seems to work best. And again, I think maybe it was David made that point this morning, it's not just about local, global interlinkages, the role of the state and governance within that state really matters too. One other thing, in something else Kevin had written, and it was drawing on Pat O'Hara's work, there's a list of items that facilitate innovation and enterprise. These can often be social capital, leadership skills, educational capital. So in terms of investing in innovation and enterprise, we do need to keep a very broad perspective, and it's not just a simple question of economic development. I was told to speak for 5 minutes. I can be reasonably good at doing what I'm told, so I'm going to leave it there and look forward to the discussion.
I'd just like to say thank you, Sally. Great precision in your timekeeping and very, very interesting points there. So I guess without further ado, as we're nearly bang on time, I'll ask Damien and Police to help convene the discussion session now. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, and thank you to Sally and to Kevin. I suppose what we're going to do during this short discussion period, in a little change from what we did earlier on, is just, I suppose, begin by posing the real question, and it's the one most important question arguably here today, and that is, we look at all the statistics, we've looked at the presentations, and they point to major challenges and problems facing rural Ireland, as Pat said earlier on. How are people going to stay in those areas? How are businesses going to remain viable? And with agriculture, I mean, that's the most startling, I suppose, statistic for me was to see the change in David Meredith's map earlier on of the relevance and the importance of agriculture in 1981 in rural Ireland to where it is today. That was a real eye-opener. But I suppose just if you raise your hand, because it's what Pat and Cathal and the other people here today want to actually find out. And we know the problems. They've done the research. They know the problems. They know the challenges. So what are the other obstacles, or what are the solutions to encouraging businesses to stay open in rural Ireland, keeping people on the land, keeping people young people in rural areas, remembering of course as well that 6% of farmers, if I'm using agriculture as an example, 6% are under the age of 35, so 94% are over 35. That's a European-wide problem. So just maybe raise your hand. There's one up here, yeah. And again, just introduce yourself maybe, and if you can just give us your views on that issue.
Ryan Smith from the Leitrim Development Company. We're involved in a project that's developing social farming as a response, an innovative response to keep farmers on their land and also to keep people from their communities accessing services on those farms. It's innovative in that it links agriculture, farming and the health and social services, which is quite a unique link. And the project that we're involved with is Intrade funded, supported, led by University College Dublin and Queen's University, Duke Stevens. It's building on innovation on farms, where farmers are becoming social enterprises with multifunctional activity on the farm. They're providing services to people with disabilities, people with mental health issues, mental health recovery, people with addictions, young people in trouble, where they're brought onto the farm and experience the benefits of working with plants and animals in enhancing their well-being in the process. In Europe, this concept is used, I suppose, in supporting multifunctionality on farms. We have developed a project here with Intrade funding, and we have a conference this week actually in Carrickaghan with about 200 people attending. But it's an interesting study in innovation, linking services, or linking, I suppose, sectors that traditionally don't cross paths, maybe with some health promotion issues.
Is it economically viable, though, Brian? I mean,
it certainly is.
It
is the changing nature of social services are that people are being given a choice in the budgets. There's large sums of money being expended by the health services, social services to provide clinical type care settings for people. These have been dismantled all over Europe, particularly, and that's moving in here where people are getting individualised budgets and choice in how their quality of life is developed. And they're using that choice to say, I want to spend some time with the farmer in my community. And they're using the budget that they get with that choice to pay the farmer. So yes.
And is it sustainable on a nationwide basis, do you think?
I would certainly say where there is real policy change, and we are finding quite a lot of issues, I suppose, in developing the concept by informing people about what it is, trying to break down the silo mentalities in health and social services. They're quite, the health service reform is a huge task in itself. It will happen, and it is happening, particularly in Europe, where governments and health and agriculture have taken it on and had real policy change, yes.
Okay, thanks, Brian. Anybody else with any other ideas from their local area? Man up there in the light blue shirt there with the short sleeves, just behind you, in front of you afterwards. Go ahead, yeah.
Yeah, just in relation to the Stuart Stevens from South Kerry Development Partnership, it's in relation to the theme that's emerged a good few times this morning in relation to the urban-rural divide. And I just wanted to make the point that it's a continuum. There isn't really a clear line that can be drawn. And I was at a conference last year on the same topic, and there was an ESRI economist there, and he was making the point that in sustainable rural communities depend on tourism and commercial farming. And I think it's probably a good definition, and the definition of rurality is probably the extent to which a rural community can capitalise on job opportunities external to itself. And there are areas down in South Kerry that don't have that opportunity at all, purely due to peripherality. And in terms of solutions, my own belief is that it's about decentralisation. It's about empowering people and giving them the economic wherewithal to do stuff themselves and not to be depending on stuff that's being done externally for them. But to go along with that, there needs to be the right structures in place that those resources are used efficiently and transparently. Thank you.
Yeah, the most important though resource, of course, are people, and where you are, and as I said, Pat will give you anecdotes of just areas down around Valencia and that part of it that are just drained. You don't have the people. If they've gone, how do you bring people back into that area? Which comes first, the job creation or the actual existence of people in those areas?
Well, it all boils down to jobs. At the end of the day, a sustainable rural community or any community boils down to how people make a living and how, the funds that are circulating within that community and within that region, how they're generated. And like if you're talking about tourism or commercial agriculture, in South Kerry it's tourism or nothing, because most of the agriculture down there is not commercial. So, it's a chicken or egg situation, and at the moment, the most valuable resources are immigrating from those communities. So, it's not really about sustainable communities anymore. In a lot of cases, it's about survival.
Yeah, did you want to finish? Did you have your hand up there in front of that? The man in front of you there in the light blue shirt? No? Okay. Anybody else? Okay, just up here. Okay.
Hi, Gabriel O'Connell, Monaghan Integrated Development. Just getting back to a couple of important points Kevin made there, and I suppose the first one was the recognition of the different types of entrepreneurs and the necessity entrepreneur, of which we see plenty in the local development environment on the ground, and particularly people being made unemployed and with good ideas and wanting to explore those ideas. And I suppose the importance of a supportive framework locally. For many years now, and I note in Kevin's presentation there was no mention of the Department of Social Protection Back to Work Enterprise Allowance Scheme, which is a very active scheme locally on the ground, run through local development companies in the main. And it might surprise people to find out that there's almost 13,000 people on that scheme at the moment who have started their own businesses in the country and who have a supportive framework. Basically on the scheme they can hold their social welfare payments for a number of years, and that acts as a form of a safety blanket while they develop the idea and get some support mainly from the local development companies, tap into leader funding, etc., and test their idea and move forward. And that's working really, really well. So I just want to stress the importance of that Back to Work Enterprise Allowance Scheme and the supportive framework on the ground, because we certainly, our experience is that somebody who is unemployed that has an idea, they don't just want a grant, they want a supportive framework, they want advice, they want to talk through their idea, and they want that kind of a high level of support that isn't normally available through the traditional routes of support. And effectively they've been voting with their feet and they have been approaching local development companies. So that strand then coupled with the opportunities of funding through the LEADER programme is certainly, in our case in Monaghan, working very, very effectively. So certainly while I note the move towards a one-stop shop approach, I would also caution that people tend to vote with their feet and actually know what they need to some extent and usually have a way of finding it out. Thanks.
Okay, thanks. I think you might want to have a word. But here's another thing, and people just, I'm going to throw it out so that, and there's a man here as well, just down here in a brown jacket. But whatever about creating, or whatever about coming up with wonderful ideas and having great, entrepreneurship ideas and trying to get the funding and all of these wonderful things, it's the small businesses in small towns that are hanging on by their fingernails. What can be done to make sure that they don't close next week, where the owner hasn't taken a salary in 2 years, where there's no, I suppose, safety net for those small family businesses as well that are struggling as we speak? I mean, that's the other big problem that I think, apart from the fact that there are roadblocks to actual businesses starting up, it's the businesses that are currently really struggling and are not getting any leeway from the banks. I don't know, is there a solution to that? Is there much more that the government could be doing to help those? And these are businesses that are struggling because the people don't have the disposable income anymore to go out and spend on goods, be it in shops, pubs or restaurants or whatever. Anyway, that's just a point to throw out. Jim? Yeah.
Jim Walsh from the university here in the news. Just on the theme of rural-urban relations, I think it tends to be oversimplified. what's needed here. There are different types of towns, with some of them performing very well, some of them performing very poorly. There are different types of rural areas. And we did some work about 10 years ago, around the time of the National Spatial Strategy, and looked at the gateways and towns that were in that. And then we looked at the areas that were beyond commuting range. And there were quite extensive places that were beyond the distance that you would normally take somebody to commute. And we added in another tier of towns. And yet, at the end of the day, there was still about 10% of the population that were within, beyond the reach of any town of any size above 1,500. They were in deep rural areas. Now, that was a reality that doesn't come up in a lot of the international literature. It's part of the settlement pattern we've got here, and it's a reality we have to deal with. What it means in practice, though, is that such areas still have a lot of potential. I think of parts of the southwest where there are the relations there are there's an urban-rural relationship between people which used to getting chocolates in deep southwest of Kerry, and their customers are predominantly urban, but they're not local urban. And equally, there's a rural relationship between Eddie Hartley, the dairy master company, who produces dairying equipment and sells it off in China and New Zealand. It is selling to rural customers. So the key difference here is that for some types of enterprise, marketing support, particularly international market, is the key to their need. For others, it's improving access to the domestic market, and it's getting the combination of those supports to people, and recognising that the obstacles in some types of rural areas are much greater than others, so that some nuancing of supports to reflect that difference in obstacles might be taken into account as well. I think it's too simple just to say that we can connect every rural place to some urban area. The population distribution just isn't like that. And some local adjustments and a recognition, though, that there is some tremendous entrepreneurship in very low density, very scattered areas. Well, the best examples of the country come from there, but they are marketing to places outside of Ireland, by and large. And it's to support more of that, I think, is what's needed.
Okay, Jim, yeah. Is this man here? Yeah, over here. Sorry, this isn't a male-only discussion. The ladies can partake as well. Go ahead.
Michael McGrath, Cedra Innovation and Workplace Learning, DCU. I just want to point out a few little things that I heard today. Pat mentioned earlier on about a one-stop shop was required, and it was Kevin has talked about the myriad of agencies that are available. I suppose a lot of problems what people would associate with downturn in employment is where is the work going to come. But historically, we're renowned as a country with plenty of imagination and initiatives, and plenty of initiatives for creating employment in the country. The difficulty is that, and talking about the entrepreneurship as well, is that the support network, even though it might be there, it may not be getting to the people who have the initiatives. There are support systems at communities level. So I believe that the initiative is there from the country, but I think the administrative system, unfortunately, because it's an inherited from a different country, that's the weak link. It was created at a time that was for a different structure. It was more concerned with the price of tea in India or the price of bananas in the Dominican Republic than maybe the situation that we find ourselves in now. It was based on a control rather than a support. So Janet outlined there that to achieve something, it should be about getting the overall result rather than concentrating on the minute detail of how you get there. So I think a mindset change, which is a huge ask, is maybe I believe the way in getting communities moving and getting employment created. Thank you.
Yeah, Michael, do you want to come back in there again? I know you were in before, but just here in front. Just Michael here.
Thanks for allowing me again. Just to address one or two things that Kevin had to say, it was particularly interesting. I think the one-stop concept could be virtual, let's say, to start with, rather than physical. And I think that would go a long way, because you have to think about, I think, the other point that you raised, and that is how local is local. So again, we all draw on our own experience, and I'm drawing on the leader experience whereby, for instance, if we invest in a company, we have to recover our grant if that company fails within a 5-year period. So local in that context is very, very local. You're in the company. It's so local. The second point I think we could make about that as well is that some little change in rules, some thinking about the future in the context of working with enterprise through networks. We operate a very successful network called Elevation, but we have to be very careful not to mix Enterprise Ireland companies, County Enterprise Board companies, and so on, in with the members of that network. Now, the rules, let's say applied, mean that that's how it has to be done at the moment. The rules could be changed to allow, let's say, one significant network operator in a rural area where we would be bringing all of the various customers together. We have managed it, by the way, in the service sector, and the service sector, interestingly, decided that, looking at the needs of the membership in the room, decided that the services they were offering were just simply not up to scratch, not meeting modern day needs. And we've seen a considerable increase in that. The local enterprise offices, by the way, the proposal is now that they can deal with companies over 10 employees and 2 million turnover. And we hope to see the same applied in the new leader program. I think that would be hugely beneficial. Also, I think to support enterprise and to overcome what I call the banking sector issue earlier on, the European Commission is interested in extending loan capital at a local or regional level to micro enterprise. And it does need to look at existing structures through which it can do that rather than putting all of its eggs into one national basket. And just a final comment, maybe slightly humorous, in that when we talk about the morass of agencies and so on, and just commenting on something you said, Kevin, those of us that say outside third level education can often think we're looking at a morass. Those of us who are in there know what each section does. We all know the difference between Charles Sutton Rye and Maynooth College NUI. So, you know, the morass comment, I think, is just a little bit over the top, and we need to be careful about taking our own misunderstandings as being the lack of knowledge of those very clients that we're trying to work for. Don't mix up the two. Thanks.
Okay, Kevin, just on that, I mean, we've heard the word enterprise, entrepreneurship, you know, helping business and all that. But just to go back to my point there earlier, is that at the expense of existing businesses that are struggling and that are well established in rural areas that have been employing for years and years and are now facing closure? You can't forget about those people either, can you?
No, and I think that was the point I made, that you need to look at both startups and entrepreneurship and with existing businesses. The different requirements, or the different supports needed.
But all the enterprise boards and organisations, their aim is obviously to help startups, but as I said, the businesses that are struggling now, what fallback do they have?
Well, maybe
They're the ones that are employing as we speak, rather than have aspirations to employ.
Yeah. Well, maybe some of there should be renewed emphasis on existing businesses, but I mean, existing businesses are still covered by existing support structures. But I think in terms of looking at where gaps and overlaps are and where there's potential for increasing leverage, you have to split out, I think, startups and the issues around startups from existing businesses that are there. Just in relation to the morass comment actually as well. I mean, that was directly from entrepreneurs, from business people, right? That they find it very difficult to understand the enterprise support landscape is out there and to identify where to go, or what type of support, and what agency.
Okay, so then, okay, anybody else? There, just raise your hands and somebody will bring a mic to you, because there's so many going up there. Maybe if we had a female voice for a chain, it'd be great.
I'll jump in while I have it. Shane Hurd from Western Resources. Just a couple of points. I think policy and the change policy is a key issue here. And sometimes definitions get lost in the middle of policy. And I'll give one example in the local context in Limerick. we have a boundary extension of the Limerick City situation, and it's very much needed and all the rest. But we're going to have a series of rural communities on the periphery of the city that are now going to be defined as urban, simply by the stroke of a pen on a policy map. And there are pros and cons to that, but there are implications for those individual communities within that space. And I think what I'm trying to get at here is that policy can oftentimes have real significant implications and sometimes indirect implications for those that are affected by it. But also, just coming back to a comment relating to what Kevin mentioned earlier, in terms of support and frustration by entrepreneurs and business people, in many cases the frustration is not necessarily with the existing support infrastructure that's there. It's that there is no support infrastructure. And we made reference earlier to the fact that if you're an indigenous Irish company employing more than 10 people for the last 5 to 6 years, there is no support from the state. Full stop. So those companies are bound to be expressing frustration because there is no support. And we, as I'm speaking from a leader company, but equally we share the experience with Enterprise Board, that we are caught where we have high growth potential companies not really looking to export, but have capacity in an Irish context, indigenous industry, and they cannot grow via support from the state. And it's one of the gaps that's in the system at the moment. So just to flag that.
Okay, a morass of hands went up around you there, so just pass the mic back to you. Okay. I'm just going to have to finish, unfortunately, at this point, because it is 1:15 and we have to be back the Minister's time schedule with us and allow us to run over. Go ahead.
Sister Lily from Glencairn. I was a former member of the Westwater Board Miscanthus Growers, and we were under JHM contractors. The department gave us a 50% grant and encouraged us to grow miscanthus. And once we had it grown, once we planted it, we were under contract for 7 years with JHM. JHM now have pulled out because it's not financially viable. The farmers were left. As a group, we wanted to set up our own business and try and explore some sort of a market. But we got no encouragement. We weren't allowed to sell it to anybody else according to the contractors. Then at some stage, I think it was up on the west of Ireland, the farmers there found that it wasn't going to be a viable crop, so they were a step ahead of us. And we got permission through the department that the farmers could plough up their crop. And listening to Janet this morning, I think she had a lot to say about policy for rural developments. I think that there's an accountability required by the department that if we give grants, that they should give support along the line. And after having planted and lost our value of our crop and no market for it, we had in our situation, we applied to Leader for a grant to set up a demonstration model for the public to show the viability of using miscanthus as a heating project, and it was to be open to the public, and it was to heat our monastery, which at the moment is a heritage building, a listed building, and we have been working for the past 5 years to get planning permission to renovate it, to bring it up to some sort of good standard, not a very fancy thing, but a good standard for people to live in. We have a community of 35, and it's a very large old building, and there's certain limitations of what you can do. So at present, we have very little heat, but the oil that it used to heat the building costs 30,000 per year. And to demonstrate how that we could become a conscious green people by using the miscanthus to heat the monastery, and as I am the farmer, that I could sell the heating to the monastery, but it was turned down by the department, and on the grounds, which I'm very sorry to say, I myself are from Northern Ireland and have lived under Dr. Paisley's policies, and was very annoyed and disgusted actually when I got my reply, and I read it for you.
Briefly, Sister Lynn.
As outlined, and the person who worked along with me was Barry Casman, the Chagos energy specialist, and he was excellent. And the reply was, my understanding from information supplied to me by the department is that St Mary's cannot apply for leadership funding as you are a religious organisation, and that grants received would be ultimately for the furtherance of religion.
Okay, I've been down there, as you know, visited you all, and I can, Sister Lily, one of the all-time great farmers I've interviewed, I have to say, and thank you very much for that. And it seems, and Duncan would know this as well, and Pat, this is something, the whole biomass project seems to be aimless. I don't know, it's gone in all sorts of weird directions, and it's confused farmers and confused environmentalists and everybody, and the sooner that is looked at and a proper plan is put in place for it, I think it would benefit us all. Okay, thank you very much. I know more of you wanted to get in, but it's time for lunch, and we'll be back here at 2 o'clock. Thank you.